So the world of shrinking population will be a world with precisely the opposite of the dynamism that characterized the period of rapid human population growth. It's a rather desolate prospect.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
So, Bethany, if an economist and an historian, a general and a politician, an environmentalist, a futurologist and a journalist enter into a bar, what do you think they talk about?
Is this your attempt at a joke? It sounds like a pretty terrible one, if you ask me.
Yeah, it is a dead joke, but they talk about fertility. This is one of the rare topics that interests all of them.
There's been a dramatic shift, one that I think is not fully appreciated by most people, from politicians to regular people. The worry for years has been overpopulation. Now, the worry, at least in some circles, is underpopulation. And the recent numbers are stunning. The fertility rate is the average number of children that are born to a woman over her lifetime. In the U.S., the total fertility rate is 1.64. If the fertility rate stays at this level, big if, in 3 generations, roughly 100 years, there will only be half as many young Americans as today. In China, the fertility rate is 1.2. This means that China's population in 100 years will be about 20% of what it is today. In South Korea, it's at 0.7. In 3 generations, there will only be 4% of the Koreans that are around today. But, Luigi, why do you want to talk about fertility in a podcast about capitalism?
I want to talk about fertility precisely because this is a podcast about capitalism. Economic theory is based on the idea of expansion, and humanity has been expanding certainly since the 1500s. If that is about to change, then the foundation of our economic theory need to be rethought.
There's also an interesting paradox here. Even in the most neoliberal economy, human reproduction is mostly out of the market system. There are cases of uterus for hire, but they are limited. The overwhelming majority of human reproduction is dictated by the social realm, not the market realm. Nevertheless, it has gigantic effects on the functioning of the market economy. This is the reason why some politicians, hello J.D. Vance, averse to intervention in a market system, are still happy to intervene and subsidize reproduction. But should we?
Bethany, we have a journalist and we have an economist. We cannot bring here all the other fellows. Who would you pick to talk about this topic?
I think I can bring you one who is able to summarize them all. Sir Niall Ferguson, a historian by training, a futurologist by trade, a deep connoisseur of the political world, and someone who has thought a great deal about the reasons why we're heading toward a global population decline and what that might mean.
But not exactly a tree-hugging environmentalist. So, Bethany, you will have to play the environmentalist today, besides being a journalist.
I will do my best. We wanted to discuss your Bloomberg piece, which is entitled Global Population Collapse Isn't Sci-Fi Anymore. And you wrote this: not many people foresaw the global fertility collapse, nor did just about anyone expect it to happen everywhere. And I can't recall a single pundit predicting how low it would go in some countries. So a 2-part question for you. How did we all get something so big so wrong? And do you think people, broadly speaking, appreciate what this means now?
The key here is that we didn't really pay enough attention to the declining fertility rates in, first of all, the Western world, and then just about everywhere, when the total fertility rate, which is in effect live births per woman, falls below 2.1, you're below replacement. And that actually started to happen quite a long time ago. So this was something that I don't think people thought much about until they suddenly woke up and realized that human population was likely to peak sooner than we thought. And then the interesting part that most people still have not got their heads around is that population could fall as drastically as it rose in the 20th century. There's a sort of assumption that I encounter a lot when I discuss this with people, that we kind of level off. We kind of just level off at 9 billion and just call it a day. But that's not what happens in any biological population. There's a really steep decline that's implicit in these low TFRs. It's very, very hard to project these things accurately, and I may turn out to be entirely wrong. I wouldn't live to see how wrong I am, but maybe my grandchildren or great-grandchildren will come on your great-grandchildren's podcast and apologize for Niall's errors. But the reality is that we're not dealing here with some self-equilibrating system, which is what economists love. They love self-equilibrating systems. That's the essence of classical economics. But it's wrong because it's a complex system and it's not self-equilibrating. In fact, you're on the edge of chaos. We end because we choose to have fewer children than we need to have to reproduce ourselves. The history that will be written one day by the last surviving historian, whose name will either be Fukuyama or Harari, will be why human beings chose extinction.
We economists like to think that many systems are stable, and in parts they're stable because when you produce less, prices go up, and this creates incentive to produce more, or vice versa. But in the fertility decision, once we broke the Malthusian logic that if you produce too many kids, you don't feed them, and so they starve, and etc. Once you broke that, there is nothing that is balancing them off, right? In a sense, if all of a sudden people decide that they don't want to have kids, it's not that there are incentives for others to produce more kids. So I want to start with you analyzing first at the micro level, and then maybe at the macro level, the fertility decision. So let's start from a very simple thing. How many kids you have, and how did you choose to have kids?
Well, I'm an outlier, Luigi. I have 5 children. I'm an outlier because I love children. Most young men don't really love children and rather dread becoming fathers. But I've found nothing more fulfilling in my life than parenthood. And if I weren't old, I'm now 60, I'd be trying to have more children because children just are the best. So I'm unusual. And I'm also a little bit of a hangover from the feckless 60s. I was born in 1964. My generation, I'm afraid, approached reproductive decisions in a haze of inebriation and lust. We didn't have dating apps, and we didn't have spreadsheets, and we really didn't do the math. We allowed, as they say in some parts of the world, the little head to do the thinking. And so I'm afraid my path to parenthood was not characterized by great deliberation. What I would hypothesize is that you economists have convinced young people that having children is an economic decision. And so they sit down and they calculate how much it's going to cost to have a child, and they see the Harvard fees and the Chicago fees, and they decide the most that they can possibly have is 1.3. And that's just not how my generation, at least my generation of Scots, approached this exciting part of life cycle.
But wasn't part of having children always implicitly an economic decision? A long time ago, people wanted to have children because they needed children to go work. And so hasn't economics always been part of the backdrop of the decision for having children, even if people didn't explicitly realize that? So maybe the difference in the current generation is more that the economic thinking is explicit rather than implicit. Or am I not thinking about this the right way?
In truth, we don't know terribly much about why people in the past had the families that they had. The key thing for me that we forget is how high infant mortality was. And so family size, in the sense of the number of live births, was partly motivated by a sense that half of them wouldn't make it. And if you wanted to have any surviving heirs, you'd better have a good number of children. It's a very different world from the world that we live in today. Now, if we come up to the recent past, it looks as if a lot emanates from the changing situation of women. The more educational opportunity women have, the more professional opportunities they have, the more likely family sizes to be limited. It's not just the pill. There's a gradual shift in the course of the 20th century towards greater control of fertility, including, of course, abortion. I mean, globally, we've moved towards more liberal abortion rules, even as some countries, including the United States, have tightened their law. The global trend over the last 3 decades is for abortion to get easier. And I think future generations will wonder why human beings developed such an enthusiasm for killing fetuses. I think that will seem like a weird thing in about 3 or 4 decades from now, but that is a trend that it's hard in my mind to feel entirely good about, but women have much more control over their infertility. Once that's the case, then I think you see everywhere, regardless of culture, regardless of geography, regardless of history, this very steep decline in TFR, and total fertility rate.
I think that actually one of the things that, as an economist, I like to believe is one thing that lead to having fewer children is the fact that now we are burdening future generation with enormous amount of liabilities, right? If you think about the size of the public debt and the size of the Social Security, Medicare, etc. liability, maybe it's too much of an economist perspective, but you think about I buy a painting or I have a kid. Now, I derive the utility of the kid. But if the kid is heavily taxed, my utility is taxed as well. And so I'm more likely to opt for a painting that is not going to be taxed rather than the kids that is taxed. So my question is, to what extent the explosion of debt, the explosion of future liability is actually discouraging people from having children?
Luigi, I'm always sympathetic to Chicago-style arguments, but I don't think many people are thinking about the federal debt relative to GDP when they're family planning. There is, I think, an economic...
So you were not thinking about that?
I was not. I wasn't thinking about any economics. I had no idea how I was going to pay for these children of mine. It's never been my question. I think today's young people do the kind of spreadsheet-type analysis of household finances that my generation didn't do. We were pretty feckless. I had no clue what the net present value of a child was, how much it was going to cost me to educate these 5 children. I'm still educating 2 of them. But I think people do today. And there are articles in the newspapers of these articles saying, well, this is how much it's going to cost you. And of course, you see the cost, and it's like the sticker shock is massive. So I encounter in my own children, some of whom are in their late 20s and one of whom is 30, I can see them doing the math in a way that I did not. And I don't think many people in my generation did. So I think there is an economic calculation going on, but it's not got to do with public finances. So I think the economics comes in that women are making a choice between career and motherhood. And there is a trade-off there that no amount of policy intervention completely gets rid of. This is where Bethany should comment, because it's really women who are the decision makers much more than men. And people have got better at avoiding unintended pregnancy, a lot better. About a third of the decline in fertility in the US since 2007 was just due to the decline in unintended births. But there's also this striking phenomenon of declining sexual activity, which is there are really large proportions of 18 to 24-year-old men who have no sexual activity in the past year, like it's a third. There are natural reasons for falling fertility. Sperm counts are way down. That's part of what's going on here. By some measures, by half over the last 50 years. Then there's all this distraction that people suggest is the explanation. People are on their phones instead of in the sack. I'm particularly interested in the paradox that as we've made mating more efficient through dating apps, we've somehow made sex less appealing. I think dating apps may be, in fact, an alien conspiracy to cause the collapse of human population, because they seem to correlate with this steep decline in sexual activity. So that's part of the story that we're looking at here. People are making decisions about sex. I don't think they're making them because of the debt burdens that they've accumulated. If people cared about these debt burdens, Luigi, they wouldn't exist. People would vote against fiscal recklessness, but they vote for it. People couldn't care less, certainly in the United States, about the rising burdens of debt, except insofar as it's personal debt. There, I think you're onto something, because I do think student debt and other forms of consumer debt, that the debt that's on the household balance sheet does play a part. Bethany, I want to ask you, because this is a conversation, how do you think about this?
So I think I'm more like you in that I did not think about the math behind having children, and I had my children, but I had my children quite late in life as well. So I also had my career and had lived my life before I had children, and I was luckily able to have both. But I thought in your piece you pointed out an article from two economists who point out that the cross-sectional relationship, I'll just read it and then I'll get to the question. The cross-sectional relationship between fertility and women's education in the US has recently become U-shaped, meaning that more highly educated women are actually starting to have more children. So how do you think about, and I see that anecdotally in people I know. So how then do you think about this intersection, if you will, of women's control over their fertility rate with this broader economic structure, that more highly educated women have more money and can afford to have children and can afford to hire nannies so they can continue to have their career? And does that point the way toward a possible solution in the form of government intervention? Or does it, or would you argue that's still a bad idea?
I think the U-shaped story is interesting because it kind of tracks American income and wealth distribution. So you're at the bottom end of the scale, there's kind of welfare ways of having a large family as long as you don't mind being wretchedly poor. But if you're in the middle, that's when it's really an expensive business. If you're at the top, you can afford to hire the nannies. And this is what it's all about for professional women. The problem is that there are these great exemplary egalitarian societies like, I don't know, Finland, where you don't have the inequality that you see in the United States, where it ought to be easy for women because there's really all kinds of ways in which a middle-class family in Finland are supported to have children. It doesn't work. They still have really low fertility. It seems to me very interesting and a problem for economics that the trend towards low fertility to a TFR below 2.1 is everywhere. And it's come down faster in Italy than in England. It's come down as fast in Iran as in the United States. So I don't think it's got much to do with the kind of economic system or the incentives, certainly through the government that exists to have children. That's the takeaway I have.
Since you ridicule my economic interpretation, then I don't see why there is any problem with the fertility bust. In a sense, in the past, people were having kids or were forced to have kids either by mistake or because they needed them to support themselves in the old age. Now that we have removed those problems, people have the optimal amount of kids. If the population will shrink a lot, that's better. It's better for the environment. It's better for reduced price of housing. It's better because the beaches will be less crowded. Why do we worry?
Here's the real problem, and you know it, Luigi, because you're just playing devil's advocate. If you have falling populations, you have economic stagnation, contraction, aging societies. Japan is the sort of leader here, but Japan is telling us what our future will be. And our future will be schools will have to be converted into elderly care homes. And elderly or aged population is a less creative population than a youthful one. So the world of shrinking population will be a world with precisely the opposite of the dynamism that characterized the period of rapid human population growth. It's a rather desolate prospect. So here I line up. I'm waiting for somebody to bring this up, so I might as well do it myself. I'm with Elon on this. If we decide to be a shrinking species, which just confines itself to one planet and goes back down to 2 billion and maybe below, that doesn't look like a good trajectory for us as a species. A couple of reasons for that. One, the climate problems they culminate before our population starts to decline. So the falling population doesn't really solve the imminent climate problem that we're creating now. And then the second problem I have with the shrinking human species is, I don't know, I can't help feeling that there may be another species waiting to take advantage of that, including the one that we're building ourselves. Remember, there's a new species that we've decided to make. And we call it artificial intelligence, but it should in fact be called inhuman or non-human intelligence. And as we build AI-enabled robots, a new species will be there, and they will become very numerous very fast. That doesn't strike me as at all a good plot line for a movie.
So does this argue then on constraints on individual choices, particularly for women, given the dire prospects ahead of population decline? Does it argue for constraints on abortion? Does it argue for constraints on contraception? Does it argue for other constraints on women's behavior that would create state incentives to have more children?
I think it's been tried. Iran would be one place, and it doesn't work. I mean, the truth is that no measures seem capable of reversing declines in fertility. And if you create the kind of restrictions you're talking about, people will get around them. It won't be pleasant, but they will get around them. So I think one of the key lessons of history is that when governments try to change the total fertility rate in the upward direction, they can bring it down. China did, India did. You can use coercion to lower fertility, but it seems to be really hard to coerce people to have more than 1.5 children.
Actually, I think that we need to rethink at least some aspect of capitalism, because you are presuming that we don't need to live with a faster and faster growth overall, which at some point in the finite world is not feasible. We need to start thinking about a world in which we might continue to increase per capita income, but not necessarily increase the number of people. And that allows us choices that are less environmentally damaging. And I'm not talking about just CO2. Think about most likely, and I'm no expert, but most likely the stuff on sperm comes from some pesticides or some crap, or chemical crap that is sent in the environment. It's sent there because people say, oh, we cannot survive in 10 billion in the world without using all the pesticides and all the pollutant on the face of Earth. But if we actually go down to 2 billion, we can have a clean world. And I understand your idea of, oh, we lose the creativity, but OpenAI and all the AI invention will substitute a lot for people in that dimension. So do we need so many people to be creative when we have system to be creative? So I think we can substitute in many dimensions, and we can abandon certain cities as ugly places and all concentrate in New York because it's more beautiful, or in San Francisco, whatever. So I don't see really the problem unless you are concerned more from military point of view. And this is where I would like to think about you to talk about the geopolitical aspect of fertility decline.
Well, if it were so obvious that we should just learn to stop worrying and love population stagnation and decline, then why are so many countries so eager to attract immigrants? Because one of the odd things about the world today is that countries with very low TFRs determinedly boost their population through immigration. The United States does it in the most eccentric way possible by having an open border. Other countries are somewhat more deliberate about whom they attract. But there aren't many Western countries that just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, we'll just be fewer then, to run Britain's beloved National Health Service without immigrants. Because you need a lot of people to run hospitals, particularly to do the menial tasks, but also actually to staff the nursing and doctors' jobs. So one thing that goes against your argument is that the societies where TFR is below 2.1 are scrambling to attract immigrants. The alternative model, which is much more prevalent in East Asia, is to rely on the robots. I think it's very interesting that the one area where China is decisively ahead of the United States technologically today is robotics. They will have far more robots. They will definitely get to the kind of robots Elon pretends he has before we do. And so the conflict of the future, when the United States and China finally go to war at some point later this century, could be between an immigrant army and a robot army. That's a plausible future, in my view. If you look at the war in Ukraine, which is the biggest war we've seen in recent years, it's probably the biggest conventional war since the Iran-Iraq war, the armies are small by the standards of the mid-20th century. And the age of the soldiers is amazingly high. The average age of the Ukrainian army is, I think, 44. But the geopolitics of conflict today is mainly a technology problem rather than a manpower problem. And that means that the war of the future, if the US and China do go to war, will be a war of machines, much more than it will be a war of men. And in that war of machines, the Chinese will have more machines. They'll have more robots, they'll have more drones. they will have really considerable capacity, which is why I think a war with China would be quite a bad idea.
I'm guessing based on what you said that you prefer the idea of an army of immigrants to an army of robots. I might be wrong about that, so correct me if I am wrong. But then the correction might be part of your answer. But the question is then, if a country were to be smart, how would it craft an immigration strategy?
Well, I'm a bit nervous of robot armies. As I suggested earlier, I don't see AI as a whole bunch of co-pilots that will make us really good at what we do. The evidence already shows that the pure AI beats the human with the AI. At least human soldiers have to sleep, whereas robot armies could just continue the slaughter until their batteries ran down, I suppose. The question you asked about the rational immigration policy is answerable in two stages. First of all, it's clear that if you allow immigration to happen too rapidly so that foreign-born share of the population shoots up from 10 to 20 or 30%, you will have a political backlash. Ask Canadians how that's going. I mean, it's very interesting to me that Canada's overshot. They had a rational policy in terms of criteria, but the scale was too much. So I think the first rule of immigration policy is do not go too fast if you want to maintain the legitimacy of your policy. And the second rule has to be to select, to have a bias in favor of skill, because unskilled immigrants, as far as I can understand from the various studies that have been done, are not an obvious fiscal positive. In fact, can be net negative. So very few countries are getting this right, but the fact that they're all trying in various ways, or so many countries are trying in various ways to get immigration right, tells me that we aren't really content with falling populations, at least not in the Western world. And that's a revealing sign of why we won't be happy when we find just how rapidly the population declines. Now, remember, I forgot to say this, but it's really crucial. The population is falling everywhere, except pretty much in sub-Saharan Africa. And so one of the interesting qualifications to be made to the argument is that as population declines everywhere else, population continues to rise at least in the next 30 years, in 8 countries: Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, plus India, Pakistan, the Philippines. Oh, I forgot Tanzania. So in the remainder of the century, if you go up to 2100, nearly all the population growth will be in Africa, because the TFRs are coming down there, but they're still really high. I mean, it's like 6 in Congo right now. So I think one of the interesting consequences of what we're discussing is that the countries that have an immigration policy will become, over time, more African. And then there'll be a point reached when we run out of Africans too. And then we'll be in the world of the 2070s, 2080s, when the global population will decline and there won't be an immigrant solution. That will be a world that I don't think Luigi's grandchildren will actually find very enjoyable.
If you're enjoying the discussions we're having on this program, there's another University of Chicago Podcast Network show you should check out. It's called The Pie. Economists are always talking about the pie, how it grows and shrinks, how it's sliced, and who gets the biggest share. Join veteran NPR host Tess Vigland as she talks with leading economists about their cutting-edge research and the key events of the day. Hear how the economic pie is at the heart of issues like the aftermath of a global pandemic, jobs, energy policy, and so much more. So, Luigi, one thing that struck me about this topic and this conversation is how very, very hard to predict it was, how wrong most thinkers got it, and how Niall confessed we might still be getting it wrong. I find that really always interesting. And I guess there are lots of examples of times where we've gotten really important issues wrong. But what do you think about the big picture idea that we've been so wrong about the question of overpopulation versus underpopulation? And what do you think about the likelihood that Niall's dire predictions going forward prove correct?
So what I was trying to say in the podcast is the human reproduction is a system that is not very well balanced. Unlike many mechanisms in the market system, when you produce too much, the price goes down, you have incentive to produce little, and so on and so forth. That's not true with reproduction. The only limit historically has been ability to feed people. I was reading somewhere that if the German chemistry during World War I had not understood how to use fertilizer, the maximum amount of population that we could support today would be 2 billion, and we are at 8. So I think that there's been like a gigantic discovery that expanded our ability to support a larger population. And so we have eliminated the boundaries, and the system has been unstable in one direction. Now we have a lot of forces, very understandable, that I think are cutting down on the number of children people want to have. And so because it's an exponential system, I think that everybody has learned with the pandemic how fast an exponential system can go. If you start to decline and you maintain this decline constant over time, the population shrinks very fast. Now, the big if will it maintain? Now, so far we have seen that the richer you get, on average, the fewer kids you have, except, as you mentioned in the podcast, if in the United States, if you are very, very rich now, you have a little bit more kids than if you are poor. But in general, with the increase in wealth, we have seen a decline in the number of kids. So hopefully we don't expect people to become poorer, and so we shouldn't expect a dramatic change.
I understand that there wasn't equilibrium on the upside. The human population continued to explode, perhaps beyond what the resources of our planet could provide. There's my environmentalist comment for you. But isn't there equilibrium on the downside at some point? And I know Niall argued that it's not. He said economists love self-equilibrating systems, but this one is not. And the human population will tip into really steep decline, and no one knows where that leads. But just as our capacity to fertilize the world and provide for people, couldn't there be something as the population starts to decline that would do the same thing?
I think that the most important innovation would be uterus for rent, or the ability to have children outside of a woman's uterus, because that will reduce dramatically the cost of producing children. And maybe we're not that far away from that. But short of that, I don't see a dramatic change, because the problem is mostly the opportunity cost of women to have children, and then secondary, the opportunity cost of parents to take care of them. But I think that the big change is women have entered the labor force in a massive quantity. The value of their time has skyrocketed. And so as a result, the cost of having a child has skyrocketed.
I'm not sure it's that, but I want to push back on something you said first, or just ask a question about it. Why would a uterus for rent, assuming we wanted to go in that direction, which is a big if, but why would that solve the issue, given that the cost isn't having the child, the cost is raising the child? So why would that solve anything at all?
First of all, I'm not so sure that the cost is only raising the child. I think there is a significant cost of having a child, and a cost that is not equally shared. You can think about a more equal society where the cost of rearing a child is equally distributed, but so far the cost of having a child is disproportionate on the woman, with career cost not trivial. So a lot of women don't see this as a priority, or they postpone in a key fertile years, and then by the time they have the time, it might be not feasible. I'm 100% with you. It will not impact the cost of raising a child, but will impact the cost of bearing a child. Now, how big that effect? You're saying that effect is more and is overwhelmed by something else? It's possible. So your view is the biggest cost is raising it
by far, not by far, not even close. Because if you have a child, it's a 9-month process. You can work during most of that process, assuming you have a healthy, normal pregnancy. You can work almost until the end of it. The cost becomes having the child. The blip to me of being pregnant and giving birth is absolutely nothing compared to the work and the effort and the time spent on raising children. But I also am not sure, going back to your original point, and this would be interesting if an economist could do this and break it down in a more systematic way. But I'm not sure the issue is as simple as women not wanting to have children because, and you're not saying it is. You mentioned other costs and issues, but as women who work not wanting to have children and not wanting to trade their career, because what I see with a lot of upper income women who don't work outside the house, they don't necessarily have more children either. And it's not because they are it's not because they want their career. They don't have a career outside the house. So if the issue were as simple as, or if that motivation were a major part of the story, then I would expect to see women who choose not to work having a lot more children, and they don't.
Yes, but I want to be very careful because I'm not trying to say we should go back to that period, but I'm just no, okay.
No, and I don't think you are, and I'm very clear on that.
No, but I'm saying the opportunity cost of women's time has exploded. In a sense, think about a woman in the beginning of the 20th century. She couldn't vote. She couldn't go around. She couldn't have a life on her own. And probably she wasn't even able to go to the movie when the movie by herself. Okay? So now, even if you don't work, but especially if you are rich and you don't work, you have the world at your disposal, right? You can do so many things. And there is an opportunity cost of having a child and of course, raising the child. But the raising is the only thing that you can delegate. Maybe you don't feel good about delegating, but you can delegate. And we do see delegating in a sense, as you said, rich people have a lot of support and then tend to have more children. So that does have an impact.
Yeah. And you might be right, because wealthier women are having more children, and it might be as simple. It might actually prove your point, because it might be wealthier women who don't work outside the house and who are able to have more children without giving up a career and without any fear of the opportunity cost, because in the overall scheme of things, there isn't one. And so maybe that data point does support your argument. I guess I was just thinking that you would see, and maybe it's too soon also, but you would see across the board more women who've chosen to stay home having more children. And, maybe that is happening in some places in the country, just not in wealthy urban areas.
But the thing that shocked me the most, I think, of the conversation is how conservative on this point Niall is. First of all, I think that his sort of sentence about abortion really threw me off, because whether you look at from women's right perspective or from the right of the unborn perspective, either way, I don't think that abortion and fertility should be in the same sentence. I think that those are two different topics, that they shouldn't be mixed.
Yeah, I understand your point. I guess I saw him as being purely an economist, even though he's not, about the issue, and basically saying, hey, if you don't have enough widgets, you're going to regret not keeping all the widgets you could have had. And so I saw it in a very data-driven way, rather than a comment on whether women should or shouldn't be allowed to have abortions. But maybe I'm cutting him too much slack on that.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm too critical. I saw it a little bit as a callous way. And it's just, whether you want more children or you don't want more children, do you really want to have more children simply by forcing women who don't want to have children?
Obviously not. And and there was a lot more to say on that point. Is this really what you would want to do? But I thought that would take the conversation in a direction that I wasn't sure he intended, and that I didn't think added to the point of the discussion. But I agree with you on that point, and obviously I am pro a woman's right to choose. I didn't hear him as making a political comment, but maybe it's impossible not to.
The other thing that surprised me is that if you keep a medical issue aside, I'm actually very interested and scared by the medical issue now that we're going to have Robert Kennedy Jr., Ministry of Health. Everything is going to be solved, right? But I'm actually concerned that environmental factors can have a dramatic impact. And this is really not only unhealthy, but worrisome. Environmentalists is not just being concerned about climate change. There are a lot of other things. To support 8 billion people and potentially 10 billion people on Earth, we have to use a massive amount of pesticides, a massive amount of fertilizer, a massive amount of chemical products that we don't know the long-term impact of. And maybe even this lack of fertility is driven by many of these pesticides. Who knows? So it is a tax on Earth that we don't fully appreciate.
If you had to argue the risks of too many people in a population that continues to explode versus the risks of too few people, maybe there's an upper limit and a lower limit. So I'm pro-human, but the idea of 20 billion of us on this planet is a pretty horrifying possibility. That said, the idea of us making ourselves extinct is not really a great possibility either.
But first of all, I do think there will be some rebound on the lower end, in a sense when there will be plenty of room and houses will be cheap because people don't inhabit anymore. People will have many more children. So I don't see this trend as inevitable on the downside. I think in the short term, it is good that we're not keep exploding. The only aspect that I'm concerned about, and surprisingly he wasn't as concerned about, is the fiscal component. Because we have set up a pension system and we set up a level of debt that is really dependent on some continuous growth in the population, at least not a rapid decline in the population. And as the population is declining, then we're forced to do maybe massive immigration in order to keep the tabs going and to pay for stuff, creating enormous social problems.
Well, I let me come back to this. I think you're unfairly conflating something. You're unfairly attributing something to him that he didn't actually say. But first of all, the thought of what governments might do to attempt to force fertility, if this really does become an issue, is a really scary prospect. Actually, in some ways, just as scary as the thought of a global pandemic. So that's a really frightening thing to think about. Margaret Atwood may have been more right than, science fiction has a way of being freakishly right, and who knows? It's a very dystopian future. But I don't think you're being quite right. He did not say he was not concerned about the explosion of debt. He said he didn't think the explosion of debt was what was stopping people from having children. So those are two different issues. I do agree with you. I think that's the most frightening thing, is the possibility of civil war between generations as you have fewer and fewer young people to support an aging workforce. And that's something the world has never reckoned with before. None of our systems are built to deal with that. None of our systems are built to deal with that.
I think you're right, and I gave to him a version that maybe was not the most palatable one. But in my view, when you have a very strong pay-as-you-go system in countries like Italy to fund the pension, and you have a very high level of debt, it's not only that people do the rational calculation the way I described, but also people when they enter the workforce, they are heavily taxed, because in Italy you have massive amount of social contribution that goes to pay for elderly people. When a big chunk is taken away from your paycheck, the last thing you want to do is to have a child. And so I do believe strongly that the more you have pay-as-you-go system in place, the more people will stop having children, because they're taxing the people exactly at the time where they are fertile.
That's interesting. And then that would, if that's right, and he's wrong, then that would point to a solution for this, at least if governments wanted to. But the problem is, I don't really see what the solution is. In other words, a solution would be to allow people to tax people less at the period where they could be having children, to encourage them to have children. But then how do you support the aging population? I guess eventually you'd have a kind of balance if people started having more children, but there would be a gap for a couple of decades that would be really problematic. One thing I was struck by in this discussion, and tell me if you were as well, but is the ways in which human beings are economic and self-serving, and then the ways in which possibly we're not. And he seemed to make the argument that one reason we weren't having children, or people aren't having children, is because they're so budget conscious. And per your point about Italy, they're sitting down, looking at the numbers and saying, this just doesn't work. And then at the same time, he dismissed the idea that we're really economic creatures by pointing out that by arguing that we're not really thinking about the gigantic national debt, and we're voting. Our young people are voting for fiscal recklessness, other than in their own personal debt. And it just made me start thinking on a different level about the ways in which human beings are rational and economic, and the ways in which we're not. And of course, if we are actually driving ourselves to extinction, then in the end, we are definitely irrational, right?
It depends. And this is if you imagine you want to have a miserable life, but the human species is not extinct, or you have a very happy life, but there is no survival of human species. Which one do you choose?
Yeah, well, I think we're all short term in our thinking, and I think would all probably, at least the majority of people would probably choose the latter. So I guess that's maybe the point is not that we're not economic or not rational, just that we're very, very self-serving, and our economics and our rationality are directed at our own short-term well-being rather than at the long-term existence of humanity, right?
No, I think that Western society is very individualistic and doesn't really think about the species or the community as an element. If you take the Catholic religion, for example, is very much about the community, so much so that you have to sacrifice for others, including having children for the happiness of God.
Yeah. Oh, it is fascinating. And even though it's very uncomfortable territory surrounding women and our entrance into the labor force and our right to work and be fully realized human beings, all of which I am obviously incredibly pro, but it is interesting that it may come at a cost. And right now, I think would say the cost is not a cost, because anything that slows down the rapid escalation of the number of people on Earth is probably a good thing, but eventually it may be a cost. And it's an interesting thing to think about, right? That something can be very right on one level, and perhaps something that generations from now, if the human race really is dying off, will look back and second guess.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodep, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Sodom Kim, Sebastian Burka, Andy Shee, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to take our conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler to discover exciting new content, events, and insights. We hope you'll join our community today, again at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler.